So meaning are the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, and generational trauma are unhealthy narratives, right? So through meaning, we get a sense of enough. But what happens when the stories you tell yourself about your childhood are stories of depression and stories of living in an orphanage and stories of never having enough? It doesn't have to make sense. Those stories you've told yourself over the years that have imprinted on your brain is that there will never be enough money. And so it doesn't matter how well you understand the numbers. And so what you need to do is be able to go back and reinterpret those narratives and realize it wasn't that there wasn't enough money. It was that you were a good person living in difficult times. But those difficult times have passed. And in a sense, you were a hero of the story because you still made it work.
Welcome back to the show, Disruptors. I'm your host, Aaron Hale, and this is Point of Impact. As we dive headfirst in this brand new year, I don't know about you, but I have already been inundated with experts, gurus, thought leaders, professionals, coaches, all of them hawking a new planner or productivity journal. They're offering to teach that seven-step course on how to create your vivid vision and set those smart goals. And be honest, do you have one of those hybrid middle school art project / ransom note things on your refrigerator you call a vision board? It's got all the clippings from GQ or Cosmo or Guns and Ammo. I don't know. All that stuff you want to be, do, have, like the luxury car, the dream vacations, that slender, muscular body. It's not a dig. I swear. I have had them in the past. I would today if I could actually see it. But, if you've got any recommendations for a non-vision, vision-based vision board, I'm open to suggestions. Well, there's a disconnect, though. Do you feel it? There's still something lacking, a missing piece that drives the meaning, the energy behind the vision and the planning and the goals. Purpose. So many of us today have a lack of purpose. Like they don't know what their life means or what they are meant to do with their lives. I know I've felt it in the past, especially when I was transitioning from the military into civilian life. I didn't know what I was going to do next or why I would be doing it. I lacked purpose. And like others, I said, I'm waiting to find my purpose. But that's the wrong approach, according to our guest today. And you are in for a special treat. This is an extra special episode. This is our very first return guest. Yes, Doc G, Dr. Jordan Grumet, the hospice care doctor turned financial literacy educator, podcast host, and best-selling author of Taking Stock, is back with a brand new book destined to be another awesome best-selling book, The Purpose Code. And what we're going to discuss in this book, in this episode about the book, is a lot about how we've got it all wrong. It's not about finding purpose. It's about creating it, making purpose for ourselves. And it doesn't have to be one of those earth-shattering, life-changing, world-moving, big P, as he calls it, purposes. It can be little p purpose. It just has to sustain us, and like I said, it's going to give us some meaning, and it'll help us find the drive. Anyways, I really enjoyed this conversation. It was great to have him back on, and even more so, I loved the book, and I think the enthusiasm you'll be able to hear in my voice. Anyways, without further ado, the return of Doc G, Dr. Jordan Grumet.
Jordan, Doc G. Grumet, thank you so much for being on the show. I'm so glad you agreed to come back on, and I've been looking forward to this.
I am so happy to be here today, and as always, I look forward to our conversations.
It was, of course, a serendipitous mistake on my part. My assistant was reaching out to everybody on my wish list, except that she hadn't crossed off previous guests from my guest wish list. So when I got this message that said, yeah, sure, I'd love to be on the show, but don't you remember? I was already on. No. But as it turns out, you've got another book on the way. Because the first time you were on, almost a year ago, we were talking about Taking Stock, your first book. And now you've got another one coming on, and I can't wait to get into it. I just finished it, and I tell you what, as excited as I was to have you on to talk about your first book, this one, I think you did just a fantastic job. You're a great storyteller, great writer, and of course it's all about purpose, but I think you found yours, or created yours, so to speak. Just to backtrack a little bit and let our audience get to know you a little bit. You are a hospice doctor turned financial educator, writer, financial literacy, and that's that's a big switch. It's kind of like going from a bomb technician to a fudge shop owner, podcaster. Anyways, talk about this. Briefly tell me about your path, your decision, and how it was maybe purpose laid out for you, or misconceptions of purpose that led you down the path, and how you got yourself on a different path.
So I wanted to be just like my father. My father was a cancer doctor, and growing up, I idolized him, and he died suddenly when I was 8 years old. And so I thought cosmically I could fix his death, because I, as a kid, saw everything through the lens of I'm responsible for everything that happens. I thought I could fix his death by becoming a doctor just like him. And don't get me wrong, that was a wonderful sense of purpose through childhood. It was the only thing I ever wanted to do. I had no interest in money or anything else. I wanted to be a doctor, so it was very purposeful for me. The problem was I eventually became a doctor, and I burned out. And I realized that this thing that I thought was deeply purposeful really wasn't. I was spending more of my time doing paperwork, and I was spending so little time in front of patients helping them. And it also made me realize this concept of, okay, I can have enough money that I don't need to work anymore, so I can get away from being a doctor, that thing that was my purpose. But what would I then step into? What would purpose look like? And it started really a process of me trying to re-identify myself outside of being a physician and trying to figure out, what does purposeful activity in my life look like? And I eventually realized that I'd spent a lot of my life doing things like public speaking and writing, things that were deeply joyful for me. But I had always told myself, you can't kind of do that for a living. That's kind of a hobby you do when you're not busy with other things. So now that I had figured out my finances and I could leave medicine, it left this space for me to start really just doing things that light me up. Not things that society told me I had to do, not things that I felt like I had to do because my dad died. I didn't have to co-opt his purpose anymore. I could actually start looking into what feels deeply purposeful to me. And that's how I discovered podcasting, Personal finance had allowed me to leave medicine when I discovered financial independence. So that allowed me to stick in the personal finance realm. But really what I was interested in doing was storytelling and podcasting and public speaking and writing books. I think that's really where my purpose, or at least part of my purpose, lay. And so it gave me the time and chance to do this. The other thing I realized is, although I was turning away from medicine, there was still a part of medicine that I loved doing that I would do even if I wasn't being paid for it. And that was hospice work. And so I knew that that was also part of my purpose. So I could leave most of medicine, but continue doing this one purposeful part of medicine. And then I could develop myself in other ways. And that's kind of how I started to pivot my life towards doing things that were more deeply purposeful and meaningful for me, as opposed to showing up to a 9-to-5, which wasn't filling me up anymore.
And of course, we've already said it quite a few times, purpose. It's something like you mentioned in the book. It creates anxiety, purpose anxiety. And it's almost a word. It's a 4-letter word. But that's because we're looking at it all wrong. Can you explain a little bit about why people are so anxious about finding their purpose and what you've discovered about it?
Yeah, so I kind of discovered something interesting. So first and foremost, I started to think about, well, what is purpose? And purpose is pretty much the reason why we do things. It's our why. And so when I looked at the literature about purpose, I found two things that didn't necessarily go together. They conflicted. One is that studies show that having a sense of purpose in life leads to longevity, health, and happiness. The studies are very clear. There's an obvious connection. But then I also found that greater than 90% of people have purpose anxiety in life, meaning this idea of purpose causes them to be anxious or depressed, or they feel lost because they don't know what purpose truly looks like for them. So this is a paradox. And eventually that's why I wrote this book, to try to figure out, well, how do we resolve this paradox? And what I came to is that we traditionally get purpose wrong. Purpose is the reason why we do things. And a lot of people set themselves up for this anxiety by having what I call big, audacious purpose. So their why is something very big and difficult, like becoming a billionaire or curing cancer or becoming president or going to the moon. All of these things are what I call big, audacious purpose. It's not that wanting to do something big is bad, but when your purpose becomes goal-oriented and it becomes highly failable and it becomes very scarcity mindset oriented, only a few people can become president, only a few people can travel to the moon, and only a few people can become astronauts. Really, it becomes a win or lose game. And when we make purpose a win or lose game, we tend to be anxious. So that's what I call big P purpose. That's the bad kind that has to do with anxiety. On the other side, there's what I call little p purpose. This is purpose that instead of being goal-oriented is process-oriented. So think about the kind of things you love to do that fill you up and fill your life with those things. It's very abundance mindset oriented, right? It's not win or lose. It's win or win. Anyone can do this. And it's not really failable. It's just going after those things you like doing. And so I found little p purpose to be much more nourishing, the kind that probably has to do with the longevity, health, and happiness. Whereas that big P purpose, the kind we have a little bit less agency over because these are these big audacious goals that not everyone can reach, that really leads to disappointment and anxiety.
So size really does matter.
The size of your P matters, correct.
Well, you started off in medicine, and then you had this very drastic change, or at least it seemed like drastic change into another career field. That's very similar to a large percentage of the audience here, the military, and service members go through that as well. Purpose is very easy. Purpose is laid out for them. They may not enjoy the job. And that's one thing, is talking about separating career and money from purpose and success. It can be parallel, not exactly the same thing. Can you expand on that?
For sure. I mean, I think career and money are vehicles to purpose, but they aren't purpose unto themselves. So they're tools, right? So hopefully our career creates a place we like going. And if we're lucky, we enjoy what we do every day. That way you have a purposeful career. Money is the same way. If money is your purpose, you're going to be upset and unhappy because you're going to get that money, but you're going to be like, what's next? You're going to be afraid of losing it, or you're going to want to double how much you have because you reached this thing that you thought was important and find that it's kind of empty. So the idea is when we make purpose less goal oriented and more process oriented. So what will money act as a tool to allow us to do? How it'll help free up our time? Or what job do we want to take that we enjoy the process of doing and not just enjoy the goal of making money or the goal of getting to that next step in your career? And so I think jobs are important, and I think making money is important. The idea is, how do we spend as much time being purposeful as possible? For some people, that'll mean doing a job that's highly purposeful for them. So if I had started my career and instead of doing what I did, I had just done hospice work, I could have both built the career around that, made money, and did something that was purposeful. So that's going to be some percentage of our population. There are other people in our population who are going to say, you know what, I'm really good at this thing and I can make money doing it and it's not purposeful for me. But then you got to be really thoughtful about saying, okay, when I'm not at work, this money I'm making in this career, what does it afford me the space and time to then start doing purposeful things in my free time? So I'm not going to be Pollyanna. It's not like we have to spend every moment of our lives being purposeful, especially when we're young. Sometimes you just need to make money. But how do we use our careers? How do we use money? How do we use our lives to look at our time periods, however many time slots we have in life, and how do we fill as many of those as possible with purposeful activities? At different times in our life, that's going to be different. But my goal is ultimately you get to a point where most of your time is being spent doing things that light you up and that feel purposeful, and less of your time is going to be spent doing things that you have to do or things that you loathe. And so that's how I connect the two. So it's great if you find purpose in your job. It's great if you find purpose in making money. But if you don't, then you have to really work at those other parts of life to make sure that purpose still shows up every day.
Yeah, it does sound an interesting concept also, that is that we, over the decades, technology, industrial, advancements, it used to be where, the executives had more free time, whereas labor worked more hours. And what happened is it kind of flipped, where the executives are working more hours, and the day job, we've got more time in the day to contemplate our purpose. And I guess that's where, we fill our time the wrong way, or we contemplate purpose and then leads to stress because we're not actually working towards that purpose. How? And this is maybe that next question with the transitioning from something that's not fulfilling, not purpose-driven career, into something that it creates purpose or fills our life with more purpose. How do you get started if your day is full of work?
So I think there are a number of answers to this. First and foremost, we have to find what looks like purpose in our lives. And I say this multiple times in the book. You don't find purpose, you create it. It's a very active thing. But we do have to consider what things light us up. And those are what I call purpose anchors. These are these inklings of what we like to do, which we then build purpose around. So one of the first things we have to do is, if you find yourself unhappy in your situation, work or otherwise, or if you feel like there's not enough purpose in your life, you have to start identifying these purpose anchors. And in the book, I talk about a lot of different ways to do this. My first book talked about the life review process. So with hospice patients, we go through a structured series of questions where we ask them about their greatest achievements, their worst failures, their most important relationships, their happiest moments, their unhappiest moments, their regrets. And these all can become templates for purpose in someone who is living and isn't dying soon, like my hospice patients. So purpose can actually come from regrets. Find what those regrets you have in your life through something like a life review, and turn them into purpose, which is the possibility of actually doing those things you want to do. That's one way. I also tell people in the book another way is to look at childhood. A lot of times the joys of our childhood actually are very purposeful for us. And eventually we become adults and tell ourselves that we have to get a job, or society puts us into a cubbyhole of what it thinks we should be. And we let go of those joys of childhood. So I tell people, think back to your childhood room. What were the posters? What were the things you loved? Were there medals for horse riding? Did you love, being an equestrian? Were there pictures of sports? Did you love playing football or basketball or baseball? Did you have collectibles? All of these things can be inklings, or what I call anchors of purpose. If we're talking about the workplace, another great place to start looking for anchors of purpose is in work. What is that part of your day you absolutely enjoy? Let's say you loathe work in general, but there's that one thing you like doing, or that one day you don't loathe going to work because you get to do that thing. Well, this gets back to the art of subtraction we talk about in my first book, but how do we take what we don't like out of work and fill it up with more of what we do like? And there's a bunch of other ways. We can throw spaghetti against the wall, right? You can try a bunch of things and find out what feels good to you. So these are ways of finding your purpose anchors. Once you have an inkling of what purpose looks like in your life, then we'd use what I call the art of subtraction, the joy of addition, and then substitution, right? So if you're working 9 to 5 and you loathe your job, what can you do? Well, you can look at your job and try to get rid of those things you loathe the most. So if there's activities you don't like at work, you can try to do less of those. Let's say there's 1 or 2 activities you do like. You can try to add those in. The joy of addition is, hey, I'm really good at doing inventory, and I do inventory once a week, and I share this with 5 other people. Why don't I see if I can take over maybe 2 of those 3 people's jobs and do the inventory for them, and then offload something I don't like and give that to those people who no longer like inventory. So again, what we do is we start with what we have. For someone else, it might be like, I don't like this profession I'm in and I have this other skill set. I'm going to go get a job in this other skill set. So you're using subtraction and addition, or maybe substitution. Maybe what I loathe about my job is not the job itself, but I don't like my boss. So maybe I'm going to go work for a different division. I'm going to substitute one division for the next. So that's how we start, is we start with the easiest and simplest. How can we change things at the moment and our job? After we've done that, whether that means changing your job, getting a new job, working in a different division, or possibly saying, I've tried everything I can and I can't change things at work, then we go to the rest of our time. Look, the Bureau of Labor does a US time survey study like every year, every few years, and they looked at free time in America, and they found that your average American has something like 5 hours of free time every day. And so in those 5 hours of free time, even if you are not doing anything different at work, you can start building purpose, creating purpose around these anchors during your free time. And so you haven't changed your work life at all, but at least you're building more purpose in your life. Maybe during that free time, you do something that eventually creates money or begins a side hustle or gets you interested in a different profession. And before you know it, you're substituting out the job you don't like for a new job, one doing things you do like. And because you've been spending these extra hours doing purposeful stuff, you've gained some new skills or made some new relationships. So it's an incremental process. It's not like you wake up tomorrow and say, I want to live a life of purpose. You stop everything you're doing and start a whole new life. A lot of times it's taking a real look at what you have already, looking at what these purpose anchors are in your life, and then using subtraction, addition, and substitution to use more of your time to do these things that fill you up and use less of your time to do these things you loathe. And if you can do that in this incremental way, you're going to have a better life tomorrow than you have today. And you're certainly going to have a better life in 6 months or a year than you have right now.
Yeah, there was an example you have in the book about the twins. And it didn't jump out at me, of course, because I got twins. But, and they have completely different personalities. They look identical, so I'm told. And most people have to tell them apart because we give them different haircuts at 5 years old. But, I can tell them apart instantly just because of how they behave and how they act. And in your book, you talk about as a hospice doctor and sister, had a completely different outlook on life than her twin brother. And would you expand a little bit on that mindset on agency versus victim mentality? Because I think that's one of the biggest and first steps in being able to define and create your purpose. Because if you feel like you're trapped in the situation you are, that victim, then it's really hard to move beyond that.
So Aristotle has a famous quote, and I'll misquote him here, but he says something to the extent of happiness is the meaning and purpose of life. And so I took that very literally and started thinking about happiness is made up of two components, meaning and purpose. Meaning is how we cognitively think about our past. It's all about our thoughts and it's about what's already happened. Whereas purpose is about our present and future, and it's all about actions. In this book, we talk a lot about purpose, but before you even get to purpose, you've got to deal with meaning. In other words, if you don't have a real sense of meaning in life, a positive sense of meaning, it's hard to move forward into purpose. And so the story of the twins is all about meaning. It's about how we interpret our past. It's the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. So the story is I was taking care of a woman who was dying, and she had a twin brother who was her caretaker. And the woman described a magical life to me. You know, her mother died while giving birth to the twins. They lived in a very poor area. The person delivering the babies was nowhere near a hospital. They couldn't afford it. But out of this young woman grew up feeling the magic of her mother having died for her benefit. She told herself a story that her mother magically gave her life so that she and her brother could live. And that outlook carried through her life. You know, she lived in a poor area. Her father continuously had to work at many jobs. But instead of feeling like a victim, she felt like the world was creating for her so she could thrive. She eventually got married. Her husband died early, but she was thankful about how much of a loving relationship they had. And even on her deathbed, dying of cancer, she still had this optimistic story about her life. When she told herself the story of her life, she was the hero, and this life was created for her. She didn't feel like a victim. So when I later went and talked to the brother, I was appalled to get an exactly opposite story. Same biographical information, same story. He grew up in the same family, but instead of feeling it magical, he felt like he never got his fair share. His mom died before he got a chance to really know her. His dad was always busy and never had time for him. He had trouble at school, so he eventually got involved in selling drugs and doing all sorts of things that got him in trouble, and he ended up being in jail. And so when he looked back at his life, he had very much a victim story. He didn't have much agency. He felt like life kept on happening to him and he had no control over it. Whereas his sister felt like she had ultimate agency and control, and her activities, the things she did, matter. And so why this story is interesting is it's the difference between growing up with a victim story versus growing up with a hero story. When we talk about happiness, if you grow up with a victim story, it's very hard to move into the present and the future. It's very hard to move into the present and the future, this place of purpose, if you feel like life never worked for you and you were a victim. Of course, you're going to have trouble with purpose because you're going to think that everything's going to fail, nothing's going to work, and someone's going to harm you or make a victim out of you. So it's really hard to be happy in the present and future. On the other hand, if you tell yourself a hero story, if you have this narrative, this sense of meaning that's really positive, you're going to walk into your present and future feeling really optimistic about purpose and action and doing things. And so that's the real difference. And it's a question of meaning. People who have a good sense of meaning and have a sense of the hero story is how they got where they are today, find purpose abundant and easy and fruitful. Whereas people who have this victim mentality have trouble moving forward into purpose. And the reason why is they never felt enough. They always felt like a victim. They didn't feel agency. So when they go into purpose, they're trying to use purpose to prove that they're enough. And it doesn't work that way. The only way you really feel enough in life is you go back to your past and come to terms with it. And so you can't purpose yourself to enough. People who grow up with this victim mentality keep on trying to, and they find themselves disappointed and unhappy.
After these messages, we'll be right back. I'd like to thank the sponsor of this episode, Extraordinary Delights, EODfudge.com. Extraordinary Delights is a disabled veteran, family-owned small business making handcrafted fudge and other sweet treats for the chocolate-loving patriots just like you. Go to EODfudge.com and check out some of our delicious flavors like triple threat chocolate with or without walnuts, mint dark chocolate, strawberry and creamy white chocolate, or my personal favorite, American Pick-Me-Up, an all-American version of tiramisu. While you're there, go to the apparel store and check out our awesome t-shirts, polos, and the baddest tactical apron on the market. You see me wear on the TikTok show, Aaron Hale's Cook Without Looking. So, right now, go over to EODfudge.com and pick out some fudge, other sweet treats for that patriot in your life with a sweet tooth. That's EODfudge.com. EODfudge.com. And now, back to the show.
It's like those, what are those visual eye tricks where you're looking at a picture from one perspective and it's a headed old woman and you turn it the other way around and it's a beautiful princess. It's the same life. It's the same experiences, just through two different lenses. And and it's a choice. And that's one of the things that, it changes everybody's health, even physically. But you mentioned, creating this purpose instead of, finding it. And that's another perspective type of thing where, you don't just sit around waiting for opportunity, purpose to land in your lap. You just start making it and you're living that present and the future and you're happy in the process. But there's also an exterior component, and that's, community. Can you talk a little bit more about creating a purpose through community and others, through finding those social groups?
So I found through my research, through all the studies I looked at, that purpose, having a sense of purpose in life, is associated with happiness, longevity, and health. On the other hand, I started looking at the general happiness data out there. And there was a study called the Harvard Adult Health Study. It started, I think, in the 1920s or 1930s, and it has been tracking people for over 70 years, interviewing them every 2 years and collecting data. And this fantastic study looked at happiness, and they found something interesting. They found that money wasn't associated with happiness. Neither was career. Nothing almost was associated with happiness except one thing, and that was interpersonal relationships. It was community. It was connections. And so the truth of the matter is, I don't know so much if purpose on its own brings all these great things. I think purpose leads to connections and community, and that's why I think we end up happier. And this is why. When you delve into purpose, the things that light you up, these abundant things where you feel like you're being your best self, you become a lightning rod for other people. You attract other people to you, especially people who have similar interests, right? So when you do things you love, other people who love what you love see you, interact with you. They want to collaborate with you. You become teacher and student, mentor and mentee. You do things together, and that's where community comes in. So I'm a perfect example of it. When I realized that for me, purpose meant podcasting and writing, I all of a sudden started hanging out and working with people who podcasted and wrote. I started meeting authors. I started going to conferences, and I started collaborating with them. Maybe we do a podcast together. Maybe we write a book together. All these things we do together based on my purpose But what actually eventually happened is I created a community of people around me, and that community is most likely what makes me happy. That's the reason for getting up every day. That's the reason I plan to go to these conferences or get to hang out with people like you on a podcast. It's because this feels deeply important to me. It all started with purpose, but the end of the rainbow, the pot of gold, was actually that happiness that came from community. It was connecting to like-minded people who were seeing me at my best because I was in the midst of doing something that really felt purposeful.
And okay, so the little P is something that you find the small purpose and things that you find fulfilling. But in order to find that, you list of various methods for discovering, your interest, taking the of that life review, and really looking back at what lit you up in the past. There are a couple other exercises you have in there, and I love when you mentioned the spaghetti method, just throw it against the wall, and it's like what is it then? The movie Yes Man. I just say yes to a whole bunch of stuff. And since reading the book, I've started doing this. I signed up for about 17 online courses. I spent a whole lot of money already. But I'm just saying yes. The mail order by my wife is going to be upset about that. But I'm finding more purpose. Creating it. Sorry. But what is the big P the 4-letter word, or is there a big P for the average person?
Yeah, so the big P is definitely the 4-letter word, and this is big, audacious, goal-oriented purpose. And so these are the big things that we strive for. It's what, if you listen to all the gurus, they talk about killing it, right? You've got to build the biggest business and be a billionaire and, be the most successful athlete, and all of these things that we don't necessarily have 100% control over. What happens is we try really hard. We don't enjoy what we're doing. So all this time we're spending doing things we don't necessarily enjoy, but we think we need to do that to get to the top of the mountain. And a lot of times we don't make it. And so we feel disappointment and anxiety, as opposed to sticking with what lights us up that we can control. So what I always talk about is when it comes to something like podcasting, I love podcasting. I love interviewing people. I love the process. That's my little P purpose. Every time I get in front of a microphone, that 30 minutes I spend interviewing someone is 30 minutes well spent, no matter what happens at the end, even if I lose the recording and can't publish it. On the other hand, if I made my purpose this big, audacious purpose, I want to have 1 million downloads a month. A lot of, that's really hard to do. Only a small percentage of people can do that. Most likely I'd fail. And furthermore, to get there, I'd probably have to do things I don't love doing. So I'd have to do crazy marketing, and I'd have to maybe pay people to do things for me so I don't have to do them myself. And I'd probably get involved in all these activities I don't like doing for this overly big goal that I might or might not reach. And all of a sudden the joy is gone. And I have more anxiety. And then God forbid I don't make it to 1 million downloads every month. I'm feeling empty and lost. And let's say I do make it to 1 million downloads a month. I'm either petrified that it's going to drop, or I'm already looking for the next big goal of 2 million downloads a month. Neither of those things serve me. Neither of them lead to lasting happiness. If we talk about the neurohormones, a lot of these are very dopamine based. And, we know dopamine feels good. You buy something, you get a hit of dopamine. You eat something good, you get a hit of dopamine. Even you exercise really hard, you might get a hit of dopamine. But the problem is that fades, and then you're like a drug addict looking for more. What we really want are some of these more long-term happiness neurohormones, things like oxytocin. Those are the kind of hormones we're really looking for. And my belief is we probably get more of that by being in what I would call a flow state, doing things you deeply love doing, the process of doing them, regardless of the outcome. And so endorphins, oxytocin, I think those probably are a little bit more healthy than that dopamine hit we get from getting to that big, quick goal. And if you think about it, especially if you don't love the process it takes to get to the goal, how long does a goal last? let's say your goal is to, win a marathon, and you train and train and train, and it's exhausting and you don't love it, but you're like, I want to win this marathon. And you go and you win that marathon. That win lasts hours, days, maybe weeks, and is gone. But you've been training for years to get there. And so if you didn't enjoy the training, if the training didn't feel purposeful to you, if it didn't light you up, you spent 95% of your time doing something you were enjoying less or not enjoying at all for that 5% of getting to the goal and feeling good before poof, it goes away and you're on to the next thing. I want us to live in the process.
Yeah, I was just thinking oxytocin when you were talking, when you said it, is dopamine is it's like a sugar high. It's a reward for finding or doing something that the mind, the body craves. Sometimes nowadays we overdo it, and not most things, but oxytocin kind of runs parallel with that, and that's really the appreciation. That's a community feeling, as a sense of well-being. And who was it? Stephen Kotler in his books talking about flow and those neurochemicals that go in that, and he talks about in regards to community, shared flow, or I don't know how he labels it, but when you're in the zone, but you're working in unison with others, and I think that's maybe one of the most fulfilling, most purposeful states that we can be in.
I think Kotler's ideas of flow are very similar to little p purpose. Like, I would say that when you're doing your little p purpose, when you're doing that thing you love doing that lights you up, in a sense, you're getting closer and closer to flow. And flow is usually not goal oriented. Usually, even the athletes who get into a flow state, when they're in that flow state, they're not thinking about the goal. They are just being and living it. And so I love this concept of how flow and little p purpose fit together. And I feel like they describe similar phenomena, maybe not exactly the same. There is a excellence to flow. There is a performing at peak level, which I don't feel little p purpose needs. But otherwise, I think they're very similar.
When it comes to flow or purpose, I think that, for one, it's in the activity, not in, like you said, the goal. Athleticism, sports, on the battlefield with some of the service members, it's a really good, a really easy example. When you're doing those, what used to be called extreme sports, but doing those things is a really easy way to touch that purpose and flow. But it's a great example. I'm an avid endurance runner, and you don't feel the flow at the finish line. It's in the middle. It's throughout. That's why you do it, is the activity. Same with purpose. And I think when in the book, you talk about this purpose as, doing the thing, that gives you that most fulfillment, that has meaning, right? Gives you happiness. And then there's the ripples in the ocean, how it serves, you serve others. And perhaps maybe that's the redefinition of the big P, changing the four-letter word into something good. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I talk in the book a lot about generational growth. And so let's talk about what generational trauma is. Most people are familiar with this idea of generational trauma. We get these narratives from our childhood. Maybe they come from our parents. They're trauma narratives, and they color the way we think about our future And in fact, those narratives don't serve us. So they actually harm us as we get older and become adults and start acting out in the world. When you practice little p purpose, I think you create the exact opposite, which is generational growth. These are things that we hand down to our children, to our neighbors, our friends, our siblings, where they see us lit up and they see us doing something we love. So instead of causing a trauma narrative, it causes a growth narrative, and it pushes them to do things they love and to get involved in things that excite them, to pursue little p purpose themselves. And so I think we affect those people around us. We hand to them this generational growth. And a perfect example of that, and I often discuss, is with my family. I have my maternal grandfather I never met before. He died before I was born, but he loved math. And so for him, little p purpose was math. And so he became a CPA, an accountant. And back in the 1950s, he loved it so much that my mom was a little girl and she would sit on his lap and he'd have that spreadsheet out and he would show her all the numbers he was putting in the different grids, because that's how you did accounting back then. And so my mom got to see him doing something that lit him up, his little p purpose. Because she was a little kid, just like I was, she tried on that identity, that purpose herself. And she said, oh, this thing I see my father doing that he loves, I kind of love it too. And so she eventually became a CPA and had me. So that was generational growth. She got it from him. She had it too. And so when I was born, I inherited this love of math. I saw my mom being an accountant. I saw that she loved it. And I had a learning disability. So I could barely read. When everyone else in my class was reading, I was coloring in coloring books. And I would have thought, hey, I'm not a very smart guy, but I knew I was good at math. I inherited that from my mom. And so I was able to overcome this learning disability partially because I had confidence, because I was good at math, something that had been handed down through the generations to me. I became a doctor, which I used my math skills to be able to do such difficult work. And one day I had a patient, and that patient was really sick, and they kept on coming into the hospital dehydrated. And I noticed a mathematical connection between two of his lab tests because I love math. And we were able to diagnose him with a rare disease. And because of that, we were able to treat him, and he didn't get sick anymore, and he didn't come to the hospital. And that guy was a pastor at his local church, and he would let in runaways into his church and allow them to sleep there and give them food. And so when we're talking about generational growth, we can draw a straight line from my grandfather, who died before I was born in the 1970s, who lived in New York. And we can draw a straight line to some homeless kid finding shelter in suburban Chicago 60 years later. That is impact. That is legacy. That is generational growth. My grandfather didn't do these things because he wanted to affect the world. He was intentionally pursuing his little p purpose, but those waves that left him and went out into the world traveled miles and miles and miles and decades, and are still having impact today. That's generational growth. That's what happens when we pursue little p purpose intentionally.
So the generational wealth isn't a portfolio or a trust fund. It's the lessons we teach, the character that we pass on.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to just be our children or our parents. When you go out into the community and you are intentionally yourself, you draw other people to you. And so an example in my book was this guy, Roman, who had a baseball card store, and he pursued his little p purpose by selling baseball cards, but it became a hub for kids like me who were nerdy and geeky and had no community. And so I wasn't his son. I was just a community member, but engaging with him in his purpose of loving baseball cards created me a much more confident person who knew how to be part of a community and who went into the world feeling a little bit better about myself. Roman died years ago from cancer, but the kids he impacted by pursuing his little p purpose are still out there in the world, changing the world today. All of that is because he pursued purpose. That's generational growth. It doesn't have to be handed down from father to child. We impact our society and the people around us just by doing those things that are important to us.
I'm glad you mentioned your mom, because as you talked about her in the book, she also brought with her some generational trauma, also having to do with numbers and money. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. My grandmother, so my mom's mother, who is married to my grandfather I never met, my mom's mother came to the U.S. from Syria in the early 1900s, and then her mother died in the Great Flu pandemic in 1917. The father couldn't take care of her and put her into an orphanage. So my grandmother grew up in an orphanage with very little money through the Great Depression. And so my grandmother would do things like hoard money, hoard food. She would hide money throughout her house. She had a lot of generational trauma about money because she grew up in an orphanage during the Great Depression. Unlike generational growth, generational trauma isn't as positive, and she handed that down to my mom. And for a long time, my mom feared money, and then my dad died suddenly, which just multiplied the trauma. So my mom was convinced that we would never have money. And I remember, even after my mom remarried and we had plenty of money, she would have great anxiety about going out for an expensive dinner or doing things that most normal people would do who had that kind of money, but she was dealing with the demons of generational trauma. And again, I want to contrast that through the gift of generational growth. We don't only get the bad stuff, we also get the good stuff. That's why I love Little P Purpose, because it's like, let's be intentional about giving the next generation the good stuff.
That is an interesting dichotomy. How a woman who grew up around numbers, became an accountant herself, still knew how money worked, is still anxious about, spending it, about having it.
So this actually fits, this fits very much into the framework of the difference between meaning and purpose. So meaning are the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, and generational trauma are unhealthy narratives, right? So through meaning, we get a sense of enough. But what happens when the stories you tell yourself about your childhood are stories of depression and stories of living in an orphanage and stories of never having enough? It doesn't have to make sense. Those stories you've told yourself over the years that have imprinted on your brain is that there will never be enough money. And so it doesn't matter how well you understand the numbers. And so what you need to do is be able to go back and reinterpret those narratives and realize it wasn't that there wasn't enough money. It was that you were a good person living in difficult times. But those difficult times have passed. And in a sense, you were a hero of the story because you still made it work. You survived. You had enough to eat. You now are thriving and have plenty of money. My mom has to look at her narratives and say, my husband died and I was afraid that I couldn't support my 3 children. But look at me now. They all got through college and I have enough money to go out and eat at a fine restaurant. You have to rewrite that narrative. You have to go from that victim mentality to that hero mentality. That's meaning. And so when you're talking about that interesting story of the woman who understands numbers and yet doesn't feel she has enough, she has a meaning problem, and you have to go back and rewrite some of those narratives.
Exactly right. And she learned the lessons from, her experiences, from her education and from the family. And, she made the best out of it, but yet that mindset, again, the framing of your life, it's like the twins all over again. Whether you have agency or you're a victim, there's circumstances there, and how you define them. So, and I don't think it's a black or white thing. I think we kind of flow from one to the other. There are like moods. Sometimes we're just not as strong or, not as happy. Sometimes we feel like victims. Sometimes we feel like the heroes. We have agency. But it's how often we can reconnect with that hero. So, as we talk about leaving legacy and making an impact and turning our little P into big P, but not goal oriented, how does one know when know when they're really they found their meaning or they've created that meaning. How do you know that this is what their right purpose?
I don't think there's anything I don't think there's anything that is right or wrong purpose. I think purpose just is. So you try on purpose, like my mom tried on math, and you decide whether it fits you or not. And you might find that it fits you for a day, a month, or a year, and then stops fitting you. So the idea is it's this very abundant thing. It's not finding the one purpose. It's choosing from the thousands of purposes and finding ones that fulfill you. There's a graphic in my book which shows this idea of there's a stick figure and it's being literally covered by this big bowling ball of big P purpose, right? And then right next to it is a picture of hands with a bunch of small little white balls of little P purpose. And you get this idea of it's a choice. Choose from this abundant plethora. So again, I don't think you have to worry about whether you got the right one. I don't think you have to worry about whether you got the one at all. I think there can be tons of purpose and you can choose and pick and do what feels fulfilling and what lights you up. I think we have to let go of the anxiety. I think we just have to accept it for what it is it's exceedingly abundant.
I think that's a great lesson, and probably why I enjoyed reading the book so much is that I think we're all taught that we're supposed to be the next Elon Musk, the next Richard Branson, the next, you name the person.
And do any of those guys look happy to you? I mean, Elon Musk looks like the least happy person I know, which means, look, all that money and all that accomplishment, that guy has more money than almost anyone. He has almost more accomplishments than anyone. And guess what? That's not enough.
Yeah, that's a hefty responsibility to bear, is changing the world. Mm-hmm. But what if you just make the world a little bit smaller and change your local environment a little bit, your family, change your own life just a little bit today, and you move towards something a little bit better? I think that little P.
Yeah, let me mention one other thing. Elon Musk, for all the things he's done for the world, there are millions of people out there right now that are setting their goals to be another Elon Musk, and those people will all end up unhappy, disappointed, and anxious because their big P purpose to be like Elon Musk was probably unreachable. They weren't the right person at the right time with the right money, with the right genetics, with enough luck. So for every Elon Musk, there are probably millions of people who have serious anxiety and depression trying to be like him. On the other hand, for every person for every person like my grandfather or this guy Roman who owned the baseball card store that I talk about in my book, there are hundreds of people, maybe thousands, who are happier, healthier, and feel better today because those people existed. And they don't have a big name, and no one knows who they are, and they never asked to change the world. All they did was pursue what lit them up, and the rest happened anyway.
Well, Elon Musk isn't a complete anomaly. There have been huge, big P people throughout history: Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Gates, Jobs, and I think maybe we all say we set set the sight so high that, of course, like you said, it's not everybody can be those people. Just making that small P, and it doesn't mean you don't have to. You won't end up wealthy. In fact, that's what you teach in your own podcast. Is about creating wealth, but you don't have to be Musk to be wealthy. And it doesn't have to be, money, of course, doesn't have to be linked to purpose. And of course, you still got to make a living.
Yeah, you still got to support yourself.
So, Like I said, the book was good. I loved listening to it. Of course, I had to read it with my text to speech software, which is kind of like having Siri as bedtime story narrator. So I'm looking forward to it coming out on audiobook so I can listen to it again. Before we wrap up, I want to go into the final segment of the show, something I'm just test driving here, but it's called the Countdown to Impact. That's 3 books or podcasts you have had an impact on your life, 2 quotes, and 1 person, all that have had an impact in your life. What can you recommend for 3 books?
3 books. Let me think about that. So the biggest book that had an impact on my life was called The White Coat Investor, and because it taught me what financial independence was, and it led me to financial independence. Another book would be J.L. Collins' A Simple Path to Wealth, because that taught me how to invest. I think, there's so many different books out there that have had an impact on me. I'm trying to narrow it down when we go outside of finances. I can't. I for good and bad reasons. For instance, like Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged had a huge impact on me for different reasons at different parts of my life, both positive and negative. Hermann Hesse, Siddhartha had a big effect on me. I've can tell. I've just read so much over the years. So I guess those would be books. You said 2 quotes. I don't think about quotes. I don't even know if I could come up with 2 quotes. And 1 person, tips. Well, I don't know if this comes from anyone, but yeah, the tips I give people is purpose before money, right? So think about what you want to do in life before you think about how much money you want to make to do it. I don't know. I'm trying to think if anything else comes to mind. But I'm not a big quote person. I don't necessarily collect quotes or.
And but then we'll move on to 1 person that's made an impact on your life.
So I always mention Terry Gross because she is the best interviewer I know. So that's from NPR Fresh Air. And so I love listening to Terry Gross. And a lot of what I aspire to do with my interviewing of other people is to be as good of an interviewer as she is. So
awesome. Thank you very much. And Don, if anybody wants to connect with you and find out more about your podcast, your book, pre-order, where can they connect with you?
Easiest way is to go to jordangrumet.com. That's JORDANGRUMET.com. There you can connect to my other platforms, which include my podcast, Earn and Invest. There's a link there, or earnandinvest.com, as well as my Substack having to do with the Purpose Code. And you can see where you can buy the Purpose Code as well as taking stock. JordanGrumet.com is the easiest way.
Fantastic. We'll get that all in the show notes. Dr. Thank you so much for coming back on the show. As always, it's been an absolute pleasure. Appreciate it.
It's been a blast. Thank you for having me on.